Hello again, and welcome back to more skeletal lecture. Right, what this one's going to be about is the metaphysis. Now, the epiphysis of a bone is, of course, the enlarged end that you would find here, the epiphysis, and then the diaphysis, with dia meaning across, that's going to be the slender shaft section of a long bone, like so. But the metaphysis is just this region, from here to here, where you have cartilage that is being actively grown, and at the same time that it's growing, being actively transformed into bone tissue. So we're going to be getting a good close-up view of that section in this next image, right about here. Good. Okay, yeah, there we go. Alright, so this is the one that we've seen in the text. The metaphysis is here in the epiphyseal plate. The thing is, there's two metaphyses in this particular example. There's this one right here, and then this one here, with a blue area of plain hyaline cartilage in between. Now, this metaphysis showed up because when you're going through endochondral ossification, we start with bone creation happening here at the primary ossification center of your cartilage model, and then the bone replaced cartilage in a longitudinal as well as lateral direction. Okay? Then we had secondary ossification centers appearing here and here in the middle of the epiphyses, and then growing in all directions from those points, including towards the diaphysis. So at some point, cartilage was being replaced with bone from the middle outwards and from the ends inwards, and thus, as a result, the last remaining bit of cartilage ends up here in the space that lies between the epiphysis and diaphysis, hence the metaphysis. So this enlargement now shows you the 5 zones that are associated with the metaphysis, starting with this one. This one right here is called the zone of reserve cartilage. It's just plain hyaline cartilage. Some of the cells are reproducing from within and kind of pushing tissues outwards. And as they get closer and closer towards the edges, towards where the bone is, then you see that there's a change in that cartilage behavior. The second zone is called the zone of cell proliferation. Now, if anything's proliferating, then that means that it is multiplying. And here, while there was some multiplication happening before, now the multiplication becomes noticeably more rapid. And not only that, the cells are organizing themselves into columns. So it's not just, random cells lying every which way, which is what you saw in the zone of reserve cartilage. Now, instead, the cells are often relatively flat, and they seem to be aligning themselves into column shapes. So you have multiple columns of chondrocytes side by side, like that. Right? And so you can see that here. Here's a column, here's another column, here's another column. Maybe not all exactly at this perfectly same angle, but those are definitely columns of cells. Okay? But now that the cells are multiplying, that means that they're, of course, pushing other cells further and further away. So the oldest cells are being pushed in this direction. And that's when we reach the next zone, zone of cell hypertrophy. And if any tissue is undergoing hypertrophy, then that means the cells are enlarging in size rather than multiplying in number. And so we see that these columns of cells are going to start to get bigger as the cells inside the columns consume the matrix around them. And not just around them, but to the sides as well. So the columns start to eat away at the matrix that was helping to hold all these cells in place, leaving only just a very bare minimum of matrix lying here in between the columns. Okay? So you can see the small cell size here versus the much more massive cell size here. Okay? And that's happening in the zone of hypertrophy. Now, this chondrocyte hypertrophy may seem similar to what you've seen in endochondral ossification. What happened there was that the chondrocytes had to get bigger first, and then they had to die, leaving behind space in which osteogenic cells could then migrate to help create bone. Well, we're seeing the beginnings of that here as well. But if you remember the endochondral ossification, before we hollowed out the interior of the cartilage, making the entire structure weaker, we first had to fortify the outside with a bony collar. Now here, there's already bone, making up the epiphysis and the diaphysis, but it's in this purple area here where it could become weaker if you eat away all the cartilage but don't fortify it first. So here's what's happening. After the zone of cell hypertrophy, we see in the zone of calcification that calcium deposits are going to appear, but not on the cartilage cells, on the remaining matrix that's between the cell columns. So if I draw that in yellow, like this, here's where the calcium is going to deposit, in between the columns of lacuna, the chambers that the chondrocytes are sitting in. Right? So this becomes encrusted and crunchy, so to speak, but that means harder and now more able to support weight, which is what you need, because in the next stage we're going to see the death of those cells inside of the columns. Right? So when you get to the next zone of bone deposition, down here, then what happens next is that your columns of chondrocyte lacuna, so drawn here, columns of chondrocyte lacuna, fortified with calcified cartilage matrix on the sides. Okay. So get the yellow in to form calcified cartilage right here. Okay. The cells inside those columns are now going to die, leaving behind not completely empty spaces, but spaces that's filled with cellular sludge, the stuff that can still provide nutrients for the development of new cells. So in the zone of bone deposition, this last one, the chondrocytes die. They leave behind the empty columns. The empty columns are fortified on their sides with calcified cartilage matrix. And then, as expected, blood vessels are going to grow in. Those blood vessels are already down here, right, in the bone, and they're growing upwards to meet the cartilage. So here the blood vessel will be growing this way into the space, and not only that, it would be growing, carrying along with it osteogenic cells that were found in deeper parts of the bone down this way. So if I draw the osteogenic cells in orange once again, the osteogenic cells will now take up position on the walls of the hollowed out column, here in your zone of bone deposition. And of course, osteogenic cells are then going to transform into osteoblasts. Osteoblasts are going to lay down osteoid tissue, and that osteoid tissue then calcifies to become bone. But let me just do a different drawing here now, over on this side. All right. So let's start with your hollow column that used to have cartilage cells in it, fortified on the outside with calcium matrix, or sorry, calcified cartilage matrix, so it doesn't collapse. Okay. You have your blood vessel grow to the interior, carrying with it osteogenic cells, which now position themselves along the walls of your hollow column. Okay. So if you were to look at this from above, from a superior view, you'd see this. Oops, wrong color. Here's your column from above, and the blood vessel be here in the center. You have calcified cartilage on the outside, so it stays sort of column shaped. Okay. And then you have your osteogenic cells start peppering the walls on the inside periphery. Okay. And those osteogenic cells will then become osteoblasts, and osteoblasts will lay down osteoid tissue. That osteoid tissue, so make it a thin one, wrong one. So that osteoid tissue will now coat the inner surface of the column that you'd hollowed out just a moment before. And then that osteoid tissue becomes spongy bone. And in quick order, the holes are filled in, and the entire thing becomes compact bone. And so, in other words, you've just made a layer of compact bone on the inside of the hollow column. And the osteoblasts that have been trapped during this growth, well, they're now still in there as osteocytes. Right? Trapped osteocytes. But let's not forget that there's still more osteogenic cells that are always going to be on the surfaces of bones. So they're going to be in here, and those osteogenic cells, multiplying constantly, will now create a new population of osteoblasts. Those osteoblasts will then lay down osteotissue and create another layer of compact bone. And then they'll repeat, and they'll make another layer of compact bone, and again and again. So the direction of bone addition is inwards, from the outside of the column towards the blood vessel in the middle. And every time that it does so, it lays down a lamella of bone tissue with trapped osteocytes inside of it. That used to be osteoblasts that were growing the tissue in the first place. And so, from the side, it just appears as if layer after layer of bone is being added to the interior. Oops, that's not very straight. There, and whoops, terrible. Okay, this is why I definitely need a stylus. But still, layer after layer, lamella after lamella are being added to the interior of the bone, of the column, until we have the thing that we recognize as an osteon. Right? The osteon will be the cylindrical unit that you find in compact bone, made of multiple lamella, with osteocytes trapped between the lamella, connected to one another and also to the central canal in that osteon, with many, many small canaliculi. The tiny canaliculi would be those little dark lines that extend from the canal to each osteocyte sitting inside its lacuna, and every osteocyte to every other osteocyte, to allow fluid flow to run back and forth between them. Right? But there you go. The point is that during the action of growth in the metaphysis, you have the creation of a column of chondrocytes, which then die, leaving behind the column that is fortified with calcified cartilage matrix, and then osteogenic cells invade that space thanks to blood vessels growing into them. The osteogenic cells then lead to the creation of bone in layers from the outside of the column towards the middle, leaving behind only a blood vessel that grew into that space, and thus you end up with osteons, the osteons that you expect to find inside of compact bone tissue. Okay. So, all of this metaphysis growth is going to continue throughout the time that your bones are lengthening. Okay? As you get older, your bones should increase in length as well as width. Right? Now, the addition of width to a bone, let's just say, like this one right here, let's wipe that out. The addition of width to the bone is going to be thanks to the addition of bone matrix to the very surface, right here, thanks to osteogenic cells that are lying underneath the periosteum. So the bone can always widen thanks to intramembranous ossification happening on the sides. But length of the bone, that is only going to be happening wherever you can find one of these growth plates, where you find a metaphysis that allows cartilage to be added first, here, here, or say here, and then that cartilage pushes the edges of the bone away from one another, and then that cartilage is replaced by bone, and thus your bone is allowed to get longer and longer. But when you reach your adult size, for women around the age of 18, for men somewhere around the age of 20-21, then the cartilage growth that we've been observing is going to come to a stop. Okay? There'll be no more multiplication of cells happening in either the zone of reserve cartilage or the zone of cell proliferation, just as. But the cells that remain will still go through hypertrophy, followed by calcification of the matrix around them, followed by the bone deposition. The remaining chondrocytes die, the osteogenic cells invade the remaining space, and then they go from forming spongy bone to compact bone in quick order. Thus, as a result, what happened? Thus, as a result, you end up with epiphyseal lines remaining where there used to be bone. That's not what it's not where there used to be bone, where there used to be cartilage. So that line right here, try again. This line here and this line here, and there'd be one down here as well. Those are the places where there used to be epiphysis, but it finally turned entirely into bone, creating essentially a synostosis, a bony joint between the two. But that means that you do have an adult bone. If you had a bone that you found that still had a piece of cartilage between the epiphysis and the diaphysis, then you could say safely that the individual the bone came from must have been a pre-adult of some kind. Alright, but there you go. Those are the actions that you find in metaphysis. It'll be important for people to know what are the 5 zones. Zone of reserve cartilage, then the zone of cell proliferation, zone of hypertrophy, zone of calcification, and the zone of bone deposition. Not only know them, but know what's happening inside of them. With the reminder that once you get to the zone of bone deposition, that's when it is going to become much more complicated, because in the zone of bone deposition you have to describe the death of the cartilage cells, the invasion of the blood vessel with the osteogenic cells, become osteoblasts, lay down osteotissue, and lamella inwards until you create a nest osteon. Okay? But those are the important features to remember about a metaphysis. Right. Then, after that, you can consider a couple different versions of growth that we've seen happening on the surface of a bone, including appositional growth and interstitial. Appositional growth is what you get when layers of tissue are being added onto the surface of an object. So let's wipe these out now. So say that you've got a chunk of cartilage like this, right? And you've got chondrocytes on the inside and chondrocytes on the outside, just filling the entire tissue. If you're going through appositional growth, then that means that the newest cartilage cells, or just cells of whatever tissue you may be dealing with, are being added to the surface of that tissue. So your newest cells are up here, which means that the oldest cells will be the ones that are in the deepest portions of the tissue. Right? And your newest cells are constantly being added to whatever surface that tissue happens to have. Right? So old cells keep getting pushed deeper into the tissue. That is your appositional growth. But if you're going through interstitial growth, then you start off with that same block of tissue like a chunk of cartilage, and now the cartilage cells that you've got are multiplying from the interior. And thanks to the fact that cartilage is kind of soft and a little rubbery, that means that it can push all the older tissue that you have already made away from the center. Right? Away from the center and off towards the sides. So your oldest cells are going to be closer to the surfaces. Oops. Not out, but old. Oops. Come on, get rid of that. Right. Let's try it again. Oldest cells are being pushed outwards, but your newest cells are in the middle. Despite the terrible work with the cursor, this is interstitial growth. It's happening from inside. Whenever you hear about anything that is inter, you should be thinking about inside or in between. In this case, in between the same tissue, layers of the same tissue. So at the metaphyses, we saw this kind of growth. Right? We saw interstitial growth happening in the very center of the growth plate, right here, right? And then we saw the older tissue being pushed away from the center of the growth plate. So that's interstitial. But on the other hand, if you're utilizing appositional growth, an example of that would be the bone that's being added to the surface of the diaphysis. In order for your bone to get thicker, say in order to deal with the extra mass that you might be putting on if you're adding weight through muscle or adipose tissue or what have you. So bones typically get thicker thanks to appositional growth, but bones can get longer thanks to interstitial growth happening inside of the metaphysis. Now, when a bone needs to grow tissue usually is dependent on stress. We are adapted to respond to stimuli, even within our bones. If there's a lot of mechanical stress being applied to a bone, then that means that that bone should be growing thicker and more robust. And this will be because as you apply strain to the bone, the osteocytes inside the bone tissue, they're going to be able to perceive that strain thanks to microfractures and damage that is done on a very, very small scale to the bone that's already been made. And so they will release chemical signals that say, we need more bone here to support this extra physical pressure that's being applied to us. And so the osteocytes will then signal to the osteogenic cells that they should become osteoblasts, that they should lay down osteotissue and add more bone material to the places that are undergoing the greatest quantity of mechanical strain. Okay. This is known as Wolffe's law, W-O-L-F-F-E, and Mr. Wolffe here determined that and described that action where bone grows thicker where stressed out. Where there's less stress, however, bones will actually get thinner, so we have to maintain a certain balance of physical pressure on the bones. Now, the reason the bone would get thinner is because if there's no stress applied, then there would be no chemical stimulus released from the osteocytes, which means that there would be fewer osteogenic cells becoming osteoblasts, and so less tissue gets deposited. And not only that, osteoclasts, your bone dissolving cells, they too will become more active possibly and start dissolving bone away from the surfaces of the bones that are not under strain. And so, in other words, if you don't use it, you lose it. This is true of muscle tissue that can atrophy, and it's true of bone tissue that can atrophy if it's not being kept under pressure. Okay. Astronauts that spend time in zero gravity can lose bone mass because of Wolffe's law. If they are not actually putting, say, physical pressure on their bones by doing special exercises to press against walls or pull against their own musculature, then their bones can actually get so thin that when they come back down to Earth, they are at a higher risk of having fractures. So, even on a healthy bone that is under normal pressures, you can still see the application of Wolffe's law in some of these weird bumps and ridges that you see on the sides. So, for instance, right here, on this bone, where you see this big mass right here, or for that matter, these masses here and here at the epiphyses, those are the places where they're going to be interacting with other bones. That's where the greatest amount of mechanical stress is at, which is why they grow larger. To this mass, we attach thick ligaments on a femur bone to make sure that stays attached to the rest of your hip. Same thing for this little bump right here. That thing is called the lesser trochanter. That also is a place where we're going to be applying mechanical stress by attaching ligaments and tendons to it. Same thing down here. At the joint of the femur and the tibia, there's more bone mass because there's more mechanical strain. Okay. But those are the basics of Wolffe's law. We will get into the chemicals that signal the addition of bone and the removal of bone in the next section when we get into physiology of bone tissue. So for now, bye-bye, and I will see you in the next video.